And good evening, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to attend. We hope you find this webinar informative. Although Condo budget preparation falls mainly to the management company, it is important that the Board of Directors understand their role in the budget process and the final outcome. So without further ado, let's get started. What can you expect to learn tonight in the condominium budgeting webinar? You will understand the purpose of the budget, what is included in a budget. We will go over a sample budget. We will talk about who does what to prepare the budget, what is the Board of Directors' responsibilities, things for the board to consider during the budget preparation process. Also, we'll talk about what a special assessment is and when to do it. Further, and at the end, the big decision, which is condo fees. Do we increase or not? From that, we will talk about implications and consequences of the board's decision to increase or not increase condo fees. At the end, there will be question period to allow for feedback from the group. From there, we will discuss next steps. So to start, what is the purpose of a budget? The purpose of the budget is to determine the needs of the corporation for the upcoming 12 months. The corporation looks at expected revenues and expenses over the next 12 months. We also look at provisions for reserves and long-term expenses. The budget is prepared as a zero-based budget, whereby every line item starts from scratch, $0, and balances the bottom line. So in short, the condominium budget sets the maintenance fees due from owners for the upcoming year. The condominium's financial health depends on its annual budget. What are the elements of the budget? The elements of the budget can be broken down into 4 categories. At first, we have the total expenses, which are expenditures incurred by the corporation. Next, we discuss the reserve contribution, what monies from the reserve fund need to be put aside. Next, we talk about the surplus required, or the cushion required, to be able to identify and ensure that the condominium will remain in good health. Next, we look at any other supplementary sources of income. Are there any parking lot fees or guest suite fees or laundry fees that can be put towards the revenue of the corporation? All of this combined determines what the condo fees will be. Reserve contribution. The reserve contribution can only be used for replacement and non-routine repairs of common elements and assets of the condominium. Like a savings account or insurance policy, to ensure funds are available for special expenditures that may come up in the future. So just to take a step back, every condominium corporation needs to have 2 bank accounts. One is the operating account, which deals with the day-to-day expenses, such as landscaping and repairs and maintenance and any kind of contracts. And the other is the reserve contribution or reserve fund. These accounts must be kept separately from each other and are securely invested. The reserve fund study undertaken by experts, whether that be an architect, an engineer, or a reserve fund planner, will examine all systems and physical aspects of the corporation and provide reasonable expectations as to when they will need to be replaced or have non-routine repairs performed, as well as estimates on how much this will cost at that projected time in the future. So when a reserve fund study is done, it identifies the replacements of the elements that have already been in place, common elements, for the corporation over the next 30 years. The cost at the projected time in the future will take into account inflation. Next, we talk about surplus. A surplus is when general revenues exceed general expenses at the end of the fiscal year. So in short, this is money left over. This does not include the reserve fund. Surpluses can be retained as a contingency fund to cover unexpected expenses in the budget or reduce and stabilize maintenance fees. The surplus can also be used to top up reserve fund. However, once the surplus money is put into the reserve fund, it cannot be retrieved for anything else. A rule of thumb is that a surplus should be equal to the higher of the largest one-time expense, which is usually insurance of the corporation or 1 month's condo fees. So for example, in a 50-unit townhouse corporation, the expense of insurance is typically the highest expense and would roughly come in at $6,000 or $7,000 a year. So the surplus for that particular condominium corporation should be on or around that $6,000 or $7,000, or the 1 month's condo fees, whichever is higher. The board should plan for expenditures within the regular budget rather than rely on a contingency fund. The reason for this is because large surpluses not only provide temptation to spend impulsively, but are wrong. As discussed, the condominium corporations act as a nonprofit organization and can't be profitable. So to show large surplus at the end of the year is not kosher. The next component of the budget is the supplementary sources of income. The supplementary sources of income is income outside of the maintenance fees or / condominium fees. So this is income that comes from other areas within the corporation. That could be laundry monies, the rental of a rooftop antenna, if there's a guest suite that is rented out, if there is parking fees. All of these add up to supplementary or extra sources of income. Surplus from previous years and any possible sources of income other than condo fees is also supplementary income. So to recap, the condo fees are determined by taking the total expenses of what is going to be spent in the corporation, adding the reserve contribution as determined by the reserve fund study, plus the surplus required, as discussed, rule of thumb being the highest expense that's incurred by the corporation, which is typically insurance, or 1 month's condo fees. Adding all that together and subtracting the supplementary sources of income, if any, and from there you have the condo fees. So the condominium fees, the fees that are brought into the corporation, have to be equal or greater than the expenses incurred on the corporation. The maintenance fees or condominium fees collected from the owners are to cover all expenses, reserve contribution, and surplus required, less any supplementary sources of income. All required expenses and savings are then divided among the owners on a percentage basis over the year and then divided into 12 monthly payments based on the size of the unit. The percentage basis is based on the Schedule D, which is found in the declaration. Some condominium corporations have the Schedule D identified whereby everyone has an equal and common share of the corporation. Therefore, everyone pays the same condo fees. Other corporations, Schedule D has different percentages based on whether their unit has 2 or 3 bedrooms or extra living space, etc. The percentage base is always based on the Schedule D, and it is divided, the expenses incurred are divided among the units, and condo fees are determined by that calculation. Next, we have the 12-month budget example. The 12-month budget breaks out expenses monthly. Some expenses belong or have a higher or lower amount in different seasons. Some may be a one-time and others may be spread evenly across the year. So for example, when we look at the first column on the far left, it identifies the condominium revenue, other income, and the total operating income for the corporation is determined as roughly $53,756. From there, the operating expense identifies the expenses incurred or perceived to be incurred based on the budget for the coming year. The expenses cannot be greater than the income, or the corporation will operate in a deficit, and you cannot budget for a deficit. The following column beside Budget 2014 is the actual 2014 expenses incurred, and it's identified that the expenses were quite a bit higher by $10,000 than what the condominium fees were. So, taking that into consideration and looking line by line, the Board of Directors, in conjunction with the property manager, need to identify for the 2015 budget where items can either be depleted or shaved off or have lower budgeted amount, or where line items need to increase. The key is to balance to zero while having a little bit of a surplus. The one thing you can't do is operate in a deficit, and separate notes should be included to explain how the numbers were arrived at. So for example, if the water and electricity was budgeted for $900 last year and is now budgeted for $1,000 this year, you need to have some evidence to support that, whether that be an increase in rates or an increase in usage. So in putting together the budget, it's important to identify who does what. As talked about, there is a partnership between the Board of Directors and the property manager, and each needs to understand their role in the process. So the budgets are prepared by the property manager with input from the Board of Directors. This input would take form in past discussions at board meetings, certain wish list items, certain items that the board or owners in past annual general meetings have identified to want to have items done throughout the corporation. The budget is voted on by the entire board for approval, and then it's signed off by the directors with signing authority. Once the budget is completed, a cover letter is put together, drafted for the board from the property manager for approval, which identifies and itemizes what the coming year's budget is based on. So for example, this past year we had very harsh winters in both Ontario and Alberta, so the board going forward may wish to budget more for snow removal or extra landscaping because of the damages that took place this past year. The budget, when it has been signed off on and the cover letter has been presented to the board for approval, is then distributed to the owners. It's important to identify that the owners cannot vote on the budget, nor do the owners have to sign off or approve the budget. The budget is the responsibility of the Board of Directors. So what are the Board of Directors' responsibilities? The Board of Directors need to review the revenue and expense numbers as presented by the property manager, and these may change upon review by the board. The board needs to ensure they are comfortable with the reasons and thoughts behind the numbers. The board needs to confirm the numbers add properly. The board needs to set the wish list and make decisions on what they feel the budget can handle financially. For example, if the corporation had a surplus last year, and the board wishes to push that surplus into a contingency fund for the following year. The board needs to identify and ensure that the extra projects they have for that money can be handled financially. Also, the board needs to ensure there is sufficient income to cover the planned expenses. The planned expenses are the needs of the corporation versus the wants. And it sometimes means that difficult decisions need to be made. Becoming a board member doesn't mean you get everything you want. So, for example, beautification on the property, extra trees being planted, or gazebos being built, that would take second place to repairs and maintenance that need to take place throughout the corporation. If the condominium fees do have to increase, and the board is uncomfortable with the increase, then the board may be prepared to take away projects considered discretionary spending. So again, to go back to our gazebo scenario, if the board has suggested that they want to have an extra $15,000 spent on landscaping improvements, however, the board doesn't want to sign off on a $15 increase per unit condo fee charge, then that's something that needs to be balanced. Things to consider during the budgeting process. Are there any possible sources of income other than condo fees? So again, to recap, in putting together a budget, there is the revenue that comes into the corporation, which is largely from the condominium fees from owners. And the condominium fees from owners pay for the various expenses in the corporation, whether that be snow removal or landscape, hydro, electricity, property management fees, administrative fees, anything of that nature. So revenue sources to look at within the corporation are other sources of income other than the condo fees. Are there parking fees? Is there a laundry room, and is there revenues taken from there? Is there a rooftop antenna that's being rented out, and as a result, extra money's coming into the corporation? Is there a guest suite that's rented out, and does that make way for extra revenues? The other thing to consider is, are you being conservative? You do not want to overestimate supplementary revenue sources, as usage will vary from year to year. So a rule of thumb we have is to budget for 65 to 80% of the current year's amount. So the reason we suggest this is because supplementary income cannot be guaranteed. For example, if you have a guest suite in your corporation that is rented out and is a supplementary source of income, you may not or cannot be able to guarantee how often that's going to be rented out in the coming year. So it's always best to err on the side of conservative so that you can't get yourself into a situation where the revenue you were expecting or anticipated wasn't being received. The next thing to consider during the budgeting process is contracts. So from contracts, that can be a number of things. As noted, it's landscaping or snow removal, or cleaning contracts, or even insurance certificates or renewals. So the thing to ask is, have you seen the contracts for the coming year? If not, do you know what the renewal dates are? Has the price increase been included? Or if not, is it yet known? If you don't have a contract for the coming year, for example, if you're putting together a budget right now, being November, for January 1, and you don't have a landscaping contract in place commensurate April 1, do you know what the increase is, and have you built in an increase upon renewal of that contract? The same with insurance. It's important to look at the increase of insurance rates in the coming year, and have you put that into the budget in order to incur for that extra cost. Next to consider is administration fees. Are there any major projects planned that will require additional communication to owners or residents? What this would mean is, do you have a special assessment that you're thinking of that would need to be communicated in writing to owners? Is there extra communication via newsletters, extra newsletters that you want going out? You need to plan for the increase in administrative expenses. Not only is this copies and distribution, but also the cost of mailing as well. Also to consider are there any expenses that span over several years that can be spread out across multiple years to prevent periodic spikes? A good example of this is an insurance appraisal. This occurs every 3 years. So you could divide the cost by 3 years and spread it out evenly. So to get an insurance appraisal on your corporation requires the assessment of someone to come out and identify the current cost to replace your condominium corporation. In the case of a perilous loss, the cost to get this assessment done can be anywhere from $2,000 to $4,000. We do recommend that this get done every 3 years, but you can certainly span that expense over budgets over the next 3 years. Next to consider when doing the budgeting process are repairs and maintenance for the coming year. Has your wish list been set? Have you accounted for each item that you wish to spend? Also, are there any one-time projects planned that would increase the historical average? Were there any one-time projects completed in the past year included that would affect the historical average that would decrease the budget in the coming year? So for example, if you were to put extra lighting in a parking garage, that would be a one-time expense that happened this year that you wouldn't have to budget for next year. So having a snapshot and looking at past expenses over the past year is a very important component to putting the budget together for the following year. So to ensure two things, that you don't have a huge surplus and are increasing condo fees where not necessary, and also that you aren't budgeting for a surprise or a decrease in the coming months. Next to consider are the utility costs. Are there any projects underway or planned that would increase or decrease consumption? For example, to talk about our parking garage scenario, if you've added lights, there's going to be an increased consumption of hydro and electricity. Have you accounted for that? Conversely, if you have a retrofit program in place, and that will be taking effect next year, your consumption and usage in electricity will go down. So have you taken that into consideration with your budgeting? Also, have any planned rate changes been published in the media? Be on the lookout for potential increases talked about in the news. One of the items that was talked about in recent news this summer in the Ottawa region was a 35% increase in hydro. So again, being aware of these increases and being able to budget accordingly will lead to a fiscally responsible board and a healthy corporation. Next for discussion is the reserve fund. Are there any major adjustments to the reserve fund plan in the next 5 years that would require the plan contribution amount to be increased? If so, by how much? Should a one-time special assessment be considered rather than increasing monthly fees? So these are things like unforeseen projects, things that are identified in the reserve fund for replacement or repair down the road, not in the next 3 years or not in the foreseeable future, that you now need to plan for. So major adjustments to the reserve plan would mean that contributions to the revenue of the corporation would need to happen. Also, are you using the contribution number from the approved reserve fund study? The reserve fund study is done every 3 years, and it's identified per that plan what the contribution needs to be for the next 3 years. You need to contribute whichever that number is. You can absolutely go higher. You cannot go lower. You cannot contribute less without issuing an alternate funding plan. Further things to consider during the budgeting process are surpluses and contingencies. So we've talked about the surplus and the need to have a surplus, or the plan, the highly suggested plan, to have a surplus that is equal to 1 month's condo fee contribution to the corporation, or the largest one-time expense to the corporation, which, as noted before, is typically the insurance. So you want to ensure that your surplus meets the minimum recommended requirement. If it's too low, you need to set your revenue plan for a positive balance at the end of the year to increase your overall surplus. So what that means is you need to ensure that you're going to have enough revenue in order to contribute to that surplus and not fall short. If it's too high, you're going to have too much of a surplus, then you need to consider the following: setting up an improvement fund to plan for future projects that will not qualify to come from the reserve fund, or new landscape projects. You want to put that money aside and still account for it. To do this, you set up an income line stating use of surplus funds to lower the current condo fees. Remember that by doing this, you're only delaying increases that may be required. Once the surplus funds are gone, they are no longer available as a revenue source. So the key is to balance the budget to avoid the need for heavy increases. Special assessment. What is a special assessment? A special assessment is an additional payment or levy required when the condominium corporation does not have adequate reserve funding to do a repair or cannot charge the expenditure through the operating budget due to lack of funds. Also, an additional payment or levy is required when a replacement or large repair resulting in the depletion of the reserve fund needs to be brought up to date. So, for example, if you're in a condominium corporation and there is a window replacement project that was scheduled for this year that is underway, and in the middle of this window replacement project, you have a massive plumbing issue. There's simply not enough money in the reserve fund study to pay for both items. And there isn't enough money in the operating account to deal with both items. You've already provided a contractual agreement with a vendor to get the windows done, so you have already incurred that expense. And with a plumbing issue, you really can't put that on hold, although it was something that wasn't perhaps scheduled to be replaced in 5 or so or 10 years. It is something that's occurred right now that the board needs to act with due diligence on and replace the matter. So special assessments are to be approved by the board. Owners cannot vote on special assessment, nor should they. Each owner is charged their portion of the assessment in relation to the size of their unit. So again, I reference Schedule D of the declaration that identifies everyone's percentage or portion of ownership in the condominium corporation. Sometimes this works out where everyone pays the same condo fees. This is based on Schedule D. Sometimes if someone has a larger unit or a smaller unit, the percentage increases change. And this is why sometimes people pay higher or lower condo fees than their neighbor. All of this is not determined by the board or the property management company. It is based on the declaration of the corporation. Both the assessment and the way of levying the assessment requires careful consideration by the board and adequate communication with the owners. So one of the things to consider is should the special assessment be payable in one lump sum, or should it be payable over a period of time? Also, when would we determine the special assessment is due? So the special assessment can be payable at once, or it can be spread over the year in quarterly payments, or it can even be spread over a 5-year plan if necessary. The decision is ultimately the board's. One of the things to consider when determining whether to special assess or whether to raise condo fees is you need to weigh the options of a one-time levy or increase, special assessment, versus a condo fee increase, because it may hurt the market value of your property. So for example, if there are two corporations that are side by side, one has incurred a loss, or one has incurred a huge plumbing issue, the other hasn't. If one decides to put the condo fees up to $300 while the neighbor, the adjoining corporation or a different corporation in the neighborhood is only paying $200, that is going to hurt the market value of the property. The big decision, condo fees, to increase or not. It makes sense and it's understandable that owners are relieved when fee increases are not or are avoided. Stability in fees is a good thing, provided it is not to the detriment of the future financial stability of the condo corporation. So what does that mean? What that means is condo fees should not be put up or should not be increased at the peril of the property values or standards of the corporation or the future financial stability of the corporation. So fees have to be increased if the following things are taking place. If the level of service is falling, if there are cuts in necessary services that would be required in order to keep the fees down, if repairs have to be passed by or aren't possible because there aren't funds, or if the reserve fund is inadequate. So as noted before, it is identified in the reserve fund study and in Form 15 of the reserve fund that is subsequent to the study that a set amount has to be put in every year. You simply can't put in less than that amount. So something to consider is increasing the condo fees 2 to 5% each year. This follows the inflation rate. For example, this past year our inflation rate was 3%. So more or less everything has gone up 3%. So for condo fees to go up 2 to 5% this year would certainly be amenable. Slow, steady increases also have less impact than facing a large jump all at once. So the one thing you want to avoid is being favorable and not increasing condo fees for a period of 3, 4, 5 years and continuing to tighten the belt and then be put in a situation where they have to go up 8 or 10%. It's always best to do little bits at a time and follow the inflation rate than to have a big jump. So as noted, not raising fees when required can result in diminished real estate values and unsatisfied owners. I'm sure we've all seen properties where they seem just a little distressed and things aren't happening. It's a very delicate balance to ensure that the revenues coming in are equal to the expenses that need to happen. So tough decisions are required by the Board of Directors. Things to avoid as a Board of Director in increasing condo fees is fear of defeat by owners, refusing to pay the fee increases, which they cannot, using the promise of low fees to be reelected, and approving unnecessary preventative maintenance, premature repairs, constant upgrades, and inefficient staff. So you do have a responsibility, and need to act with due diligence as board members to ensure that you are fiscally responsible and that the corporation is healthy and viable. So instead of putting off condo fee increases because of the tough decisions necessary, ensure that your decisions are made based on well-researched facts. So if you don't feel that you have the facts necessary to make an increase or not, your property manager is there to partner with you and assist with you. Ensure the fees are collected and spent wisely and not squandered. So again, we spoke about this in the early part of the presentation, that the needs versus wants part comes into it. You have to put the needs of the corporation ahead of your wants. Ensure that you're only paying for costs the corporation is responsible for under bylaws, and charge back expenses due from owners. So you want to ensure that you're not incurring costs for things that you shouldn't. For example, any kind of damages within a unit or within a unit, I guess, that the owner is responsible for and not the corporation. Also, you want to communicate the reason behind the fee increase effectively so that owners understand the budget is to protect their investment. We talked about the covering budget letter. That's the best approach with openness and transparency, identifying why the increases are taking place and that the increases are taking place so that there is the expenses can be reaped and covered and that there are no things that are going unrepaired. Also, continue to find creative solutions to problems with efficient use of funds. So in larger corporations, we encourage that committees take place, and you can have a landscaping committee or a social committee, and what this does is brings the corporation together and increases community approach, as well as can add to the beautification of the corporation with very little money spent. So what are the implications and consequences of your decision? So every decision has its consequences, of course, and in addition to keeping fees low at the risk of poor everyday upkeep, if the board fails to maintain an adequate reserve fund with increased contributions or special assessments, they could be sued by the owners. So the responsibility of the board is to exercise due diligence and sound judgment. A number of the corporations have directors' liability insurance, and this may not be covered if due diligence has not been done. So an example of this would be if you had, if you operated this year and it came into a huge deficit because of something that occurred, and you wanted to move into the 2015 budget with a deficit, with a scheduled deficit. You simply can't do that. You have to operate as a zero or a surplus, and that would put you in a libelous situation. So next we have questions. If you have not done so already, please type your questions in the area provided on the screen where it says type message here, and we would be happy to address as many questions submitted tonight as possible. And those questions that we're unable to answer, we will follow up with those we are not able to discuss personally. Our first question is a special assessment better to be done in a one-time payment request or in separate payments? That's a very good question. So a special assessment is best done based on the amount it is. So for example, if you're on the board of directors and there is an elevator retrofit that needs to happen, or a roofing project, or anything of a sizable amount. And by a sizable amount, I would deem anything more than, say, $10,000 or even $6,000, depending on the type of corporation or property that you live in and where you're located. That would determine whether the payment should be spread over 4 months, or 4 times a year, or even over a 5-year period, or a one-time payment. So really what you want to do is be able to ascertain and determine what the best route is for owners and the corporation. So for example, say there was a special assessment and it was required that every owner pay $25,000. If you're an owner in this corporation and there's a $25,000 special assessment and you choose to move because you don't want to incur that cost and you would like to reside elsewhere, that $25,000 special assessment will have to be disclosed and will show up on the status certificate, which may mean selling your home is a little more difficult. So again, the Board of Directors works in concert and in partnership with the property manager to discuss and identify the best ways to approach the special assessment based on what the fee is. So in short, it really comes down to how much money it is, and that's typically determined by how much are condo fees, how much is the market value for each unit, and what's the best approach to take. And be assured that at the end of the day, the Board of Directors, being owners themselves, want to ensure that the best possible decisions are being made, not only for themselves, but on behalf of the corporation as well.
Great. Next, is it better to ask for a special assessment after the repairs are completed, or do you use the estimated value?
It's best to ask for the special assessment ahead of time. So typically what happens, in my experience in managing many condominiums, is that an event will take place or an assessment will take place whereby it's determined by a professional and various quotes that a major repair needs to occur. And there's no way around this repair. There's no way to band-aid the situation. It really comes down to the work has to be done, and how do we do this? So our approach and how we partnership and support our board is through full transparency with the owners. So if possible, before the work's done, the special assessment is delivered out so that the funds are in place when the job is being underway and completed.
Great. How do you determine each unit owner's condo fee?
So there's 2 ways. Actually, there's just one way. Schedule D of the declaration identifies what the percentage of the ownership of the corporation is. So there's typically 2 ways that's worked. So you'll have Schedule D, and it's in everyone's declaration, whether you're a townhome or high-rise. And either you've got, I'll just take 50 units for example, 50 units and everyone has the same contribution, or you have 50 units and everyone is based on a percentage. And really what a condominium corporation is in short is every single owner has a percentage of ownership in together equaling 100% in the corporation. So in some situations you've got a 3-bedroom unit which would have a higher percentage of ownership versus a 2-bedroom unit that has a lower percentage. Sometimes you have a row of townhomes or you have a high-rise condominium where all the units are the same. In that case, everyone would pay the same. But the short answer is the Schedule D of the declaration. And if you're not sure how that works, feel free to reach out to your property manager and they will have that information. That's what makes up the contribution to condo fees, is because we need to capture the condominium fees from each owner based on their percentage or contribution or ownership of the condominium.
What would exhaust due diligence for a director?
What would exhaust due diligence? So, for example, if the budget, and I'm just going on past knowledge, if the budget for the year was being developed for a January 1st new fiscal year, and the reserve contribution was less than it should have been, or if the condominium corporation was operating in a surplus, and the property manager would put together a draft budget for the corporation, or for the board of directors to approve, identifying that there has to be an increase in condo fees because this year the condominium corporation ran in a deficit. And again, as I talked about, the board of directors and the property manager work together, but in the end it's the board of directors that directs and it's the property manager who manages. So if this information was provided to the board and an increase in condo fees were suggested based on gathering the facts and hard evidence identifying that there was a deficit and condo fees had to go up, and the board of directors said, no, we don't want to put condo fees up and we are going to operate in a deficit, that information would need to be disclosed in the minutes of the meeting, and that may put the directors in a libelous situation if and when disclosed, because the board has to act with due diligence and ensure that they are fiscally responsible to the health of the corporation.
Is the preparation of the reserve fund study and finalizing it the responsibility of the management company or the board of directors?
So I'll take you through the process of what happens. So every 3 years, the property manager has to go out to tender to get quotes on the reserve fund study. The reserve fund study, by law, can only be done by an architect, an engineer, or a reserve fund planner. We recommend an engineer or architect always, just because they're licensed. But you can always go the third route, reserve fund planner, and it is identified in the Act. So what happens is the property manager goes out to tender and gets the quotes. I would say 9 times out of 10, what happens is the company, whether it be an architect or an engineer that did it the 3 years prior because they have prior knowledge of the corporation, is typically chosen to do the study, and they tend to be typically a little less in cost because they are aware. They will come out and do the assessment. The assessment is either in person I'll start off year 1, the assessment is done in person where the engineer or architect is on site and they do an investigation of all the various items throughout the corporation, the asphalt, the windows, the brickwork, everything to do with the corporation in hand. The 4th year, the reserve fund study that needs to be done does not have to be on site. It's what's deemed as a Class 2 reserve fund study. And what they do is they take the information from the past 3 years and ask for an assessment of any changes that weren't scheduled for. So for example, if you put in a new roof but that wasn't scheduled to be done for another 10 years, that would be disclosed. From there, the engineer or architect will update the reserve fund study so that you can identify where the spending and costs need to be. And then on year 7, the engineer or architect comes back out on site again, does a full assessment, and goes from there. So once the assessment's done, whether it's a Class 1, which is year 1, Class 2, year 4, Class 3, year 7, that information is presented to the board. It's discussed. Typically, we recommend that the person or company that put the report together is there at the board meeting to answer any kind of questions. And once it's agreed upon, the information is then registered and provided to the property manager, and there is 180 days that the property manager and board has to send the information out to the owners to advise them that the reserve fund study has taken place. And the next 1, 2, and 3 years, this is the contribution to reserve funds that need to take place. Typically at that time, there aren't any surprises per se, but if something's identified as a major project that needs to take place, sometimes there's a special assessment that is suggested at that time.
Great. So if we have enough reserve funds and we foresee no major repairs, it's okay to not raise the fee?
Yes, providing, so there's two things. So as talked about, there's the operating account, the operating operating expenses, thank you, Jillian. That's the day-to-day expenses, and that's where repairs and maintenance and landscaping contracts and things like that come out of that, that bank account. And then the other is the reserve fund account. So that's things like capital expenses, things that have already been in place. So asphalt, roofs, fences, anything to that effect. So you have to follow the reserve fund study as planned and as noted in the reserve fund plan that was received every 3 years. So for example, if the reserve fund study says in 2013 you have to contribute $25,000, in 2014 it has to be $26,000, in 2014 you have to contribute $29,000. If you're ahead of the game, you can't decide I'm not going to contribute what the reserve fund study says I have to. So by law, and the information has been sent out via a Form 15 to all the owners, it identifies that that money has to go into the reserve fund. So that you don't really have a choice on. If on the operating side, at the end of the year you have a surplus, and the surplus is sizable enough that you feel that condo fees don't have to go up, then condo fees don't have to go up. But what you do need to be able to determine is that by not putting up condo fees, you do have that cushion or that improvement or contingency fund we talked about, which has to be 1 month equal to the condo fees or equal to the highest one-time expense that you have. So again, to use the 50-unit condo, if you have a surplus of $6,000 or $7,000 that you're going to carry over to the next year, and your highest expense is insurance at $6,000, then I would recommend that you have the option of not putting up the condo fees.
I think you answered this question in your last answer, but just to clarify, what is the legal position of the reserve fund study? Can we go against the recommendation if the directors do their due diligence? In short, no. The reserve fund study, as noted, is done every 3 years. And if the reserve fund study identifies that this is the contribution that you need to make each of the next 3 years, then you need to do that. Now, it does happen where there's a change of board of directors or there's a change in outlook, and the board determines that they feel that the reserve fund contribution is way higher than necessary. So for example, say you're in a condominium corporation and it's only 7 years old, and it's identified per the reserve fund that you need to replace the elevator shaft, or you need to replace the HVAC unit on the roof. And you've identified that everything's in working order based on factual information you've received from your maintenance company, and you feel that this is a huge detriment to the reserve fund, you do have the option to go out and get another reserve fund study done by another company. It doesn't have to be the same company. The only cost you're going to incur is an additional reserve fund study. But if you're contributing
$80,000 into a reserve fund, the account every year, and the board is feeling it should be maybe $50,000 or $60,000, then that extra expense of $2,000 to have a reserve study done is a good cost-benefit analysis. You do need to follow the letter of the law, whatever letter of the law that you have in place. You do have the right to go against it, but you need to have something else in place that you're referencing for that contribution. It can't kind of be just willy-nilly.
Does a special assessment need to be included with the budget, or can it be done at any time?
The special assessment can be done any time. So, and the reason for that is the board of directors and the property managers sit down typically 60 days before the year end of the corporation, and they put together the budget based on the last 9 or 10 months of spending and the projected next 12 months of what needs to be spent. But sometimes things happen. For example, you may live in a condominium corporation where the plumbing stacks, which is a huge job. The plumbing stacks are big stacks that run in behind the bathrooms that go from the bottom floor up to the top floor. Those may not be replaced per the reserve fund study until 2018, but for whatever reason a pipe bursts and you need a replacement, and all of a sudden it's a $30,000 expense to the corporation that wasn't budgeted or scheduled for, so a special assessment would happen. So special assessments aren't, just to clarify, it's not something that the boards sit on and kind of hum and haw, oh, should we spend this money or not, and take months and months. The special assessment is typically something that comes up that was completely unexpected, that is a huge expense.
How much should you budget for insurance deductible? Does the corporation have to pay the invoices directly to the contractor, or does the insurance repair, or is that part covered directly by insurance?
So every condominium corporation has to have their own insurance, and the insurance certificate will be, you should have a copy as board of directors. Larlyn would always have a copy of your insurance certificate. And the insurance certificate identifies on it what the deductible for the condominium is. So it's not in stone, but a rule of thumb for putting forth a claim is, so say you're in a condominium corporation and the deductible is $1,000, and something happens and to replace it or to repair the item is going to be $4,000. Our recommendation as a property management company, but again it's always up to the board, is to balance the difference between, do you put it under the insurance or do you just pay the cost? Because anytime you put a claim on the condominium corporation, chances are the next year your insurance is going to go up. So it's, again, a delicate balance. Of course, if you have a huge expense that's incurred, then you need to look at whether that goes under insurance or not. Two of the things that we highly recommend with all of our condominium corporations, and this could form part of another webinar in the future, is ensuring that your corporation has a standard unit bylaw and ensuring that you have an insurance deductible bylaw. So what that means is if there's any loss or any kind of damages that are occurred, it's shared both by the corporation and the owner. So for example, if you don't have these things in place and there's a big massive flood and you live in a high rise, the cost will be incurred by the corporation. And it happens sometimes where you have 2 or 3 floods, whether it be bathtub or shower or dishwasher, and all of a sudden the corporation has incurred the cost of tens of thousands of dollars that can be avoided.
Great, and super idea. I can share with you that there are plans for a 3-part webinar series in 2015 on insurance, and one thing will be included our standard unit bylaws and insurance deductible bylaws. So good segue. We are looking at some preventative measures for water main leaks, which requires a large amount to be spent next year. Can the future maintenance be pushed back, or would this require a special assessment or increase in condo fees?
It would depend. That's a very good question. It would depend on what the cost for this major project would be. And again, something to consider is a special assessment doesn't have to happen all at once. It doesn't even have to happen within the same year. So there are such things as a special assessment that span over the course of 5 years if it's something large. Again, as we talked about in the presentation, you have to kind of delineate between what the needs and wants of the corporation are based on the best fiscal health and property standards of the corporation. So it's a very delicate balance on how to do those things. Again, you don't want to have a big special assessment and raise condo fees and defer maintenance on various items, because then the value of the property can go down. So that sounds like making kind of a large list of what's necessary and what needs to get done, and then prioritizing based on what needs to happen right away to avoid any kind of future problems, and then identify how to plan for paying for those items from there. And again, the reserve fund study is there to pay for things, capital expenses, and items that are already in existence. So for example, the plumbing stack issue I talked about, if a plumbing stack goes and it's a $20,000 or $30,000 or $40,000 expense, that money can come out of the reserve fund, even if it wasn't scheduled to come out of the reserve fund. But what you can't do is deplete the reserve fund study to the point that next year when you're planning on getting new roofs or new asphalt, there's no money. So that's where the special assessment comes into play.
Would you increase the condo fees 2 to 5% per year, even if there's a surplus?
It would depend on, that's a very good question. It would depend on the surplus. So if again, using the rule of thumb, if the surplus we have is on par with 1 month of condo fees and or the largest expense we have, if you're above that by a lot, I would recommend that you don't have to increase the condo fees. But you don't want to get into a situation where you don't increase condo fees for 6 or 7 years and everyone gets in this mindset of condo fees don't go up, and then the next year they go up 5 or 8%, because that's a little bit shocking for people. So you want to ensure that if you are in a surplus situation, that's when you can look to things around the corporation to identify how do we beautify our place. Does that mean we put more mulch down? Should we have a garden? Is it time to take some of the surplus and throw it into the reserve, although there aren't any major projects going on right now? So it's, you know, there's an old saying, the best time to fix the roof is when the sun is shining. So sometimes putting that extra monies away and still having a little increase every so often isn't too bad. So again, it's a balance. If you're in a surplus situation where condo fees going up seems like a notion that isn't required, then I wouldn't put the condo fees up. But you don't want to be in a situation where you put people in you don't have condo fees going up for a length of years.
Is there a minimum amount of what the reserve fund should be based on the number of units, or is it based solely on the reserve fund study?
The reserve fund study is solely based on the job done by the engineer or the architect, whereby they come out and identify what has to be done. So for example, the reserve fund plan may come back to identify that $50,000 needs to go into the reserve fund study this year. The reserve fund study is paid by the condominium fees that are incurred by the owners. So there's an easy way for the property manager to break down on the budget if the board or owners were interested to see what contribution of their condo fees goes to the operating expense and goes to the reserve fund.
Speaking of the reserve fund, if the board follows through with the recommendation of the reserve fund study, but it wasn't enough to cover expenses, is the architect or engineer on the hook?
Not really. Unless you're in a condominium corporation that is less than 7 years old, because there is a program called Carry On that is in place for new condominiums that are built. And there are different stages in Carry On claims, whether it be 1 year or 3 year or 7 year, where that would affect the reserve fund study. It's quite complicated, and maybe could form part of another webinar in the future, but you could come back to the architect or engineer, and they wouldn't per se be on the hook, but you could probably get a new assessment done. So they are basing their recommendations and an assessment based on their best educated guess by being on site. Sometimes a brand new HVAC unit should last 15 years and it only lasts 8 years. The engineer or architect can't really be held liable for that. So it's a little bit of a tricky situation.
Is the condo law different from province to province? Assuming it is, can you let us know more about the Alberta legislature?
It is different from province to province. Here in Ontario, we have the Condominium Act of Ontario. In Alberta, I believe it's called the Condominium Act, but it's not of Alberta. And the laws are quite different. There is a link to that act, and Jillian and I will work to get that posted for you, and you'll be able to reference that.
And this is Jillian again. Just to clarify, our last webinar was on how to read your financial statements, and this one being budgeting. They're actually being, and we're going to do some information on reserve fund studies as well. They're going to be all combined into a downloadable e-guide, and information will be broken out province by province, act by act, for those specific learning topics. But in the meantime, we will get the links shared. We can include it in the follow-up email to this webinar. So thank you. Speaking of province, Carry On, I believe, is Ontario.
It is, yes. I believe there's similar legislation in Alberta for new condos, but we will follow up on that as well.
And who has access to condo bylaws?
Condo bylaws are registered on title, so the board of directors would certainly have access to the bylaws, as well as if any owner wanted a bylaw, they would certainly receive that. When an owner buys into a condominium corporation, they would get a status certificate, and in the status certificate, the rules and regulations of the condominium corporation as well as the declaration and bylaws would be present. But it's a huge stack of paper, and I can appreciate and understand that everyone doesn't have a chance to read through all of it. So that would be at the request of the property manager, and they'd be happy to give that to you.
That is all the questions that I've got that have been submitted. So I believe if you type in more questions, they will still be recorded, and if there's some that we didn't get to, those can be addressed directly as well. And as I said, the downloadable e-guide is going to be combined with the last webinar, as well as some information on the reserve fund study. Information will be broken down by province specifically, as they are different. So I guess I will thank you for attending. Thank you again for your patience. when we sorted out the audio issues. The recording will have the complete audio, and that will be, the link to that will be emailed to you, to all participants, as well as those that gave up on us and left. So I do apologize for that again. Thank you so much, and looking forward to the next event.